welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 48, The Sons of Monomakh, Part 3. Just a reminder that we are about a month away from the Episode 50 Q&A, so if you have a question to ask, send it through to hello@the RussianEmpireHistoryPodcast.com, Facebook, Twitter, or if you listen on the Spotify app, you can send questions there. Just scroll down the episode notes and fill out the form. Yuri has been there on the outer reaches of Rus, intruding into our narrative more and more. Like Sauron, his arm has grown long, imposing his influence over the 1,000 kilometers from Sundial to Kyiv, and earning himself the name of Yuri Dolgoruky, Yuri the Long Arm, sometimes rendered far-reaching. Finally, he has taken Kyiv, but I think we're all aware that there's nothing especially secure about the way he managed it, and Izyaslav is still out there. Sviatoslav Olgovich turned up straight away with his by now traditional request that all the patrimonial demands of the Olgovichi that Izyaslav had taken be returned to him. Yuri agreed and returned Kursk, which had been given to his son Gleb. Beating Izyaslav meant that Yuri was now in possession of the Monomakh home city of Pereyaslav, so he was willing to give up Kursk to secure support. He then demanded and received Vladimir and Izyaslav Davidovich's of Chernichiv's pledge of allegiance, for whatever that was worth. That left Izyaslav, and that conflict was still hot. Both Yuri and Izyaslav took the interesting position that neither of them had the right to claim the throne of Kyiv, since Vyacheslav, as the eldest Monomakh, had the legitimate claim. However, since Vyacheslav had been unable to take Kyiv for himself, he was going to have to reach an agreement for a partnership with one of them. The standoff gradually escalated back towards open warfare in early 1150. Yuri moved his son out of Vyshgorod by Kyiv and invited Vyacheslav to move in. Izyaslav attacked Gleb in Peresopnitsa. Gleb surrendered, and Izyaslav had his sons convoy him back to Yuri, pointing out along the way that all the land he could see belonged to them and their father. Izyaslav continued gathering troops, and the outnumbered Yuri moved to Gorodets-Astyorsky. Vyacheslav seized the opportunity to occupy Kyiv. The people of Kyiv obviously had no faith in Vyacheslav, understandable given his performance over the last couple of decades, so they forced him to leave and declared Izyaslav their king. As soon as he was back in Kyiv, he sent his son Mstislav to shift Rostislav Yurievich from Pereyaslav. Yuri sent Andrei to support Pereyaslav and summoned the Davidovichi and Olgovichi to help drive Izyaslav out of Kyiv. Vladimirko of Halych also joined him. To avoid being stretched too thin, Izyaslav acknowledged Vyacheslav as his father, and Vyacheslav acknowledged Izyaslav as his son. Izyaslav left to join his army, leaving Kyiv to Vyacheslav. Izyaslav had assembled a large army, but maybe one with too many components to perform well. Besides his own men and the Rus warriors of his son Mstislav and brother Vladimir, He had contingents of Hungarians, Poles, and Black Caps, also known as Chorny Klabuki or Karakalpak, Turkic riders from the steppe. Despite having the superior numbers, they were defeated by Vladimirko of Halych without even encountering Yuri's main force, and Izyaslav had to flee to Vladimir in Volhynia. Vladimirko attempted unsuccessfully to install Yuri's son Mstislav in Dorogobush and then settled for Peresopnitsa. Yuri appointed Andrei to Turov. This would lead Vyacheslav to accuse Yuri of attempting to seize his patrimony, and it shows that Yuri was acting more aggressively than Izyaslav, who had not made any attempts to seize Yuri's towns when they were contesting Pereyaslavl. Vyacheslav's officials and the peoples of Kyiv had asked Izyaslav to return, so he prepared to attack Yuri. Svyatopolk was left to defend Vladimir in Volhynia, while Izyaslav marched with Vladimir, Mstislav, and their Hungarian allies. He declared to his druzhina that he was not prepared to reject his inheritance or patrimony again, and that he would either die or recover the throne. So, whatever his words to his uncle or Yuri, Izyaslav was looking at Kyiv as his patrimony, and therefore claiming that he had the strongest right to sit there. Yuri once again withdrew to Gorodets-Astyorsky, and Izyaslav was able to occupy Kyiv without a fight. Vladimirko was disgusted by this. He was unable to understand how, with his sons placed in strategic towns, Yuri had allowed Izyaslav to catch him off guard. Izyaslav once more went to Vyacheslav and acknowledged him as his father, and Vyacheslav acknowledged Izyaslav as his son. Once again, they took over the joint rule of Kyiv. While Izyaslav might have considered Kyiv his own, keeping Vyacheslav around like this deprived Yuri of the ability to claim that Izyaslav was violating the rules of succession. A short time after, Rostislav Yurievich died. As the ruler of Pereyaslavl, he was buried in St. Michael's alongside his uncles Svyatoslav and Andrei. In the spring of 1151, Yuri summoned his allies for another attempt on Kyiv. Vladimir Davidovich, Svyatoslav Olgovich, Svyatoslav Vsevolodovich, some of the younger nephews and their polovtsi, assembled in Gorodets-Astyorsky in April. Izyaslav Davidovich had, for reasons unknown, gone over to the other side, where he joined Rostislav Mstislavovich of Smolensk and his son Roman, Vladimir Mstislavich, Boris of Gorodna, the people of Kyiv, the Turks, Berendei and Karakalpaks, and even some Pechenegs, escapees from the final destruction of the Pechenegs in the Balkans, who had straggled back to the steppe. Yuri attacked Kyiv and was defeated. He returned to Pereyaslavl, but that was too close to Kyiv, and Vyacheslav and Izyaslav wanted him out of harm's way. They laid siege to Pereyaslavl and ordered Yuri to return to Suzdal. He left, and Izyaslav appointed Mstislav to rule the city. Yuri only went as far as Gorodets-Astyorsky, and that was still too close. So Izyaslav prepared to attack him again. Yuri decided to move back to Suzdal. But even that was not enough for Vyacheslav and Izyaslav. Their advisors were telling them that with Gleb Yurievich in Gorodets-Astyorsky, he could summon their steppe allies to attack from the south, while Yuri attacked from the north. So, in the winter of 1152, Iziaslav Davidovich of Chernihiv and Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich marched on Gorodets-Ostiarsky, threw down its walls, and burned the town to the ground. Gleb was driven off. Just like when he had thrown out Rostislav for supposedly plotting against him, Iziaslav had made a serious error. By attempting to eliminate Yuri's influence in the south, he had managed to provoke him into doing exactly what he had been trying to prevent. Yuri recruited Rostislav Yaroslavich of Ryazan, his cousins from Murom, his Polovtsi allies, and set out for the south. But rather than attacking Iziaslav directly, he punished Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich and Iziaslav Davidovich for taking part in the attacks on his lands. Sviatoslav Olgovich joined him again, and they laid siege to Chernihiv, burning the suburbs and allowing the Polovtsi to pillage at will. Then they withdrew, ravaging the Zadisenya as they went. Yuri left his son Vasilko with Sviatoslav Olgovich's support, necessary as Iziaslav was in fact soon planning to punish him for changing sides again. In February 1153, Iziaslav, his nephew Roman Rostislavich of Smolensk, Iziaslav Davidovich, and Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich set out to conquer Novgorod-Seversky and resolve the Sviatoslav Olgovich problem. The campaign was a failure that resulted only in a peace agreement that nobody wanted. Meanwhile, back in Susdalia, Yuri seems to have decided to take a time out from trying to seize Kyiv and to invest in developing his own domain. He terminated Susdalia's payments of tribute to Kyiv and spent his time building towns and churches. So, as I'm sure some of you are wondering, what is this Susdalia that has appeared in our tale from out of nowhere? This is a perfect opportunity to take a quick look at the domain of Vladimir Monomakh's youngest son, a domain that will form the basis of what subsequently emerges as Muscovy. Susdalia was the name given to the region that the Rus had originally called the Zaleskaya Zemlya, or land beyond the forest. The Volga flowed through the middle of the region to join the Oka in the east. The Klyazma rose northwest of Moscow and also flowed to the Oka. What would soon become the regional capital, Vladimir, stood on the middle of the Klyazma and was often known as Vladimir Zalesky or Vladimir on the Klyazma, to distinguish it from Vladimir in Volhynia. It was founded by Vladimir Monomakh, but remained merely a fortified outpost at the time we are dealing with here, when Rostov and Suzdal were the principal cities. Most of the oldest important towns lay either on the Volga or the Klyazma, or in the area lying between them. Tver, Uglich, Yaroslav, and Kostroma on the Volga, Vladimir and Starodub on the Klyazma, Suzdal, Pereyaslavl-Zalesky, Rostov, Dmitrov, and Yuriv-Polsky lay in between. First mention of the region was back in the Testament of Yaroslav, where Vsevolod receives Pereyaslavl as his patrimony, including its subordinate lands of Rostov, Suzdal, Bielo-Ozero, and the Volga region. It passed down through Vsevolod to Vladimir Monomakh, and then to Yuri, without being contested. Perhaps this was because little attention seems to have been paid to it at all. It was not until later in Vladimir Monomakh's time that it even had a princely ruler appointed. It appears to have been too remote from the heartland of Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Pereyaslav to worry about. However, the region is relatively fertile, connected to the Volga and Baltic trade routes, and was growing steadily. It also bordered the Volga Bulgars, who were themselves growing strongly, and at the south, as we've already heard, it ran up against the Chernihiv lands, where the Monomach's disputes with the other ruling families meant that defences were necessary. With this in mind, Vladimir Monomakh appointed Yuri to rule in Suzdal, and as we have seen, he ruled largely independently of Kyiv. You'll have already picked up that Yuri had a long reign, some 37 years in total, and he deserves to be recognized as the founder of Suzdal as a state. Under him, the borders with Chernihiv in the south and Novgorod in the north were set. New towns, including Moscow, were founded. Churches and monasteries were built, and Yuri's sons were established to rule in their own cities. A divide was starting to form between northern Rus, Susdalia and Novgorod, which were acting increasingly independently of Kyiv, and southern Rus, Kyiv, Chernihiv, Pereyaslav and Galicia. Despite their historical importance, Suzdal and Rostov have not become major modern cities. Rostov, which is known as Rostov Veliki, Rostov the Great, to distinguish it from Rostov-on-Don, which did become a big modern city, has a population today of around 30,000, while Suzdal has less than 10,000 inhabitants. While Yuri's attempts to intervene in southern Rus met with mixed results, his rule in his own domain was an undoubted success. During this period, when he turned his attention away from Chernihiv, Kyiv and Pereyaslav, he moved his capital to Suzdal, and the region acquired the name of Susdalia. But the absence of adventures to the south did not mean that he was focused on internal matters alone. In response to Susdalia encroaching on their territory, the Volga Bulgars had attacked back in 1107. Yuri had then led a campaign against Bulgaria in 1120 that resulted in an uneasy peace between them for a couple of decades, during which he continued to build towns and fortifications to assert and defend his borders. Yuri ended Susdalia's payment of tribute to Kyiv. This was a turning point, an assertion that Susdalia was not a vassal of Kyiv and that he did not owe fealty to the king of Kyiv. At the same time, he continued to assert his place in the succession by claiming to respect Vyacheslav's claim to rule Kyiv and insisting that his own claim put him ahead of Mstislav. In a pattern that we're going to see repeated over the coming decades, while Susdalia enjoys a period of relative peace, consolidation and growth, in southern Rus, the squabbling and disputes between the ruling families will continue. Various Monomachichi, Mstislavichi and Davidovichi will continually be going to war with each other. In 1153, Iziaslav went to war with the excellently named Yaroslav Osmomyśl, or 8 wits, 8 brains we might say in a more modern idiom, due to his great wisdom. The chronicles do not tell us what the pretext for the conflict was. Yaroslav had succeeded his father Vladimirko in Halych, and his father had been an ally of Yuri, and Yaroslav appears to have followed suit in not pledging allegiance to Vyacheslav and Izyaslav. Izyaslav assembled the Karakalpak, who, by the way, are not the same Karakalpak as live in Uzbekistan today. His sons, the Mstislavichi and other allies, but was unable to defeat Yaroslav, so the campaign ended with nothing. Besides Izyaslav Davidovich of Chernihiv, all Izyaslav's allies were Monomakhichi from the south and west. Suzdalia and Smolensk appeared to be secure with Yuri and Rostislav. Pereyaslav was with the Mstislavichi, but Volhynia was becoming increasingly fragmented. The following year, 1154, Yuri turns his gaze south once again. This time he marched directly against Izyaslav and Vyacheslav, most probably with the intent of recovering Gorodets-Ostiosku. However, luck was against him. When his forces reached the Vyatichi land, some kind of sickness struck the horses and forced him to abandon the campaign. Before Yuri could assemble his next campaign, there was a new crisis in Kyiv. On 14th of November, 1154, Izyaslav died. He had been the clear leader of the Mstislavichi, and by seizing the throne of Kyiv, he had made his own family, the Izyaslavichi, claimants to the throne of their father. But seizing the throne had destabilized Rus, and the expansion of pretenders to the throne did not bode well for the future. With Izyaslav dead, Vyacheslav was alone in Kyiv, with the usual results. Within days, Izyaslav Davidovich turned up at the gates, claiming that he was there to pay his respects and pray at the dead king's grave. For once, Vyacheslav showed some resistance. He refused Izyaslav Davidovich entry to the city and summoned Rostislav from Novgorod, whom Izyaslav had most likely designated as his successor. Vyacheslav was by now an elderly man, so while he waited for Rostislav to arrive, he needed to appoint someone to command the troops if Kyiv was attacked. He had several options. Izyaslav's son Vladimir was in Vladimir and Volhynia, while his own brother Vladimir was in Dorogobush. This Vladimir had already acted as the commander of Kyiv when he failed to save Igor's life. Another son of Izyaslav, Mstislav, was in Pereyaslav. Rather unexpectedly, Vyacheslav chose Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich, who was an Olgovich, but was also a nephew of the Mstislavichi, as his mother, Maria, had been Izyaslav and Rostislav's sister. While the presumed heir was travelling south, Izyaslav Davidovich and Sviatoslav Olgovich of Chernihiv set the grounds for another confrontation by demanding that Yuri succeed Izyaslav. Rostislav made it to Kyiv first. Meanwhile, Gleb Yurievich, who was with the Polovtsi, attacked Pereyaslav. Rostislav sent his son, Sviatoslav, to assist with the defense, and the attack was driven off. Rostislav began preparing to attack Chernihiv. While Rostislav was in Vyshhorod assembling his forces, word came from Kyiv that Vyacheslav had died. He was buried in the church of St. Sophia next to his father. I think we have to rate Vyacheslav fairly badly. It's hard to get much of a sense of the personality of the rulers of Rus during this period, as the chronicles are very dry and matter-of-fact. But Vyacheslav has consistently taken on rulership without fulfilling any of the obligations of a ruler, whatever the reason was. He has to bear some of the blame for the fracturing of southern Rus. After his death, Turov passed under the control of Svyatopolk Izyaslavich's descendants and ceased to play any significant role in Rus politics. Rostislav decided that the best way to secure his position in Kyiv was to get recognition from Izyaslav Davidovich of Chernihiv. This would kill two birds with one stone, aligning the Olgovichi with the Mstislavichi against Yuri, and meaning that Izyaslav was dropping his own claim to Kyiv. Izyaslav Davidovich, on the other hand, saw no reason to concede. Rostislav's place on the throne was still up for discussion, and he thought that, together with Gleb Yurievich and his Polovtsi, he was stronger than Rostislav. It came to battle, and Rostislav lost. He fled back to Smolensk. Mstislav Izyaslavich abandoned Pereyaslavl and fled to Volhynia. The people of Kyiv were afraid that the Polovtsi would enter the city, so they invited Izyaslav Davidovich to take Kyiv. He rewarded his supporters by appointing Svyatoslav Olgovich to Chernihiv and Gleb Yurievich to Pereyaslavl. But Izyaslav was no more secure than Rostislav. Even before Rostislav had set out for Chernihiv, Yuri had already left Suzdal to march on Kyiv. He gathered his allies as he went, including Gleb's Polovtsi, who returned to his army. While he marched through Smolensk, he reached an agreement with Rostislav, who submitted to his seniority as the eldest of the Monomakhs, and further augmented his military superiority. Izyaslav Davidovich had also undermined any claim that he might have, because he and Svyatoslav Olgovich had jointly summoned Yuri when Izyaslav Mstislavich died. Therefore, they had already acknowledged him as the rightful junior ruler, and when Vyacheslav died, that made him the rightful claimant to Kyiv. So when Yuri reached Chernihiv, Svyatoslav Olgovich acknowledged his right of succession. Izyaslav would also have to contend with the already established opposition of the people of Kyiv to rule by an Olgovich. So, when Yuri reached Kyiv with his allies, Svyatoslav persuaded Izyaslav to submit without a battle. Yuri declared that Kyiv was his patrimony, not Izyaslav's, for Izyaslav's father had not sat on the throne. However, there was no punishment for Izyaslav, as he had summoned him upon the death of Izyaslav Mstislavich and had been generous to Gleb when he gave him Pereyaslavl. Ruling Kyiv was a temptation that anyone could fall for, but no harm done. So on 20th March 1155, Yuri Dolgoruky once more ascended the throne of Kyiv. As was traditional, he then dispensed domains to his sons. To Andrei he gave the fortified outpost of Kyiv, Vyshgorod. To Boris he gave Turov, to Gleb, Pereyaslavl, and to Vasilko the Porosia region between the Stugna and Ros rivers. That is, he surrounded Kyiv with his sons in an attempt to secure his position. Another son, Mstislav, remained in charge of Novgorod, while the two youngest, Mikhalko and Vsevolod, remained at home in Suzdalia. As had become traditional, the Polovtsi marked the ascension of a new ruler in Kyiv by raiding Rus territory on the Ros River. Vasilko Yurievich successfully drove them off. According to the chronicles, Izyaslav Davidovich started making moves to challenge Yuri, but Svyatoslav Olgovich talked him out of it. Yuri continued to be fairly tolerant towards the other ruling families. The only junior ruler that he punished was Mstislav Iziaslavich, who had rejected his claim to Kyiv. Mstislav was still in Peresopnitsa, which was traditionally part of the Kyiv domain, so Yuri sent troops to evict him. Mstislav fled west to Lutsk, but that was not enough for Yuri, who asked Yaroslav Osmomysl to drive him out of there too. Mstislav went to join his uncle in Vladimir Volhynia, which was too strong for Yaroslav Osmomysl to take on. Yuri's wife travelled from Suzdal to Smolensk and was then escorted to Kyiv by Rostislav of Smolensk, now the eldest and head of the Mstislavichi. Yuri greeted him as a friend, and Rostislav used the occasion to intercede for his relatives. His brother Vladimir was summoned from Vladimir Volhynia, along with the two Iziaslavichi, Mstislav and Yaroslav. Vladimir and Yaroslav made the journey to Kyiv, but Mstislav was afraid of what was waiting for him and did not. Yuri welcomed the Mstislavichi warmly and sent professions of friendship to Mstislav. We generally get the impression from the chronicles that Rostislav was not as ambitious as his brother Iziaslav had been. The opposition between the Mstislavichi and the Monomakhichi had been driven by the contest for Kyiv, and if Rostislav was not going to press his claim, then they were all willing to let bygones be bygones and be friends. Around the same time, emissaries arrived from the Polovtsi, who were interested in establishing a new treaty after being soundly beaten by Vasilko. Yuri marched out with his new allies, Rostislav and Vladimir, Yaroslav Iziaslavich, and troops from Galicia. The Polovtsi saw his overwhelming superiority in forces and fled into the steppe. The next move was to send Iziaslav Davidovich an offer to conclude a peace. Iziaslav could also see the overwhelming forces arranged against him, and he agreed to peace. Therefore, by skilled maneuvering, Yuri had consolidated his authority in Kyiv by forming alliances and making displays of force without actually having to fight. Partially, this was also down to the strength of his claim as the last of the sons of Monomakh, but we have also seen throughout his career that Yuri was cautious and pragmatic, and had nearly always offered his opponents an alternative to fighting. He continued to strengthen his position by marrying his son Gleb to the daughter of Iziaslav of Chernihiv, and Mstislav to the daughter of one of the prominent boyars of Novgorod. But not everything worked out so well. In 1156, the Mstislavichi in Volhynia went to war with each other. Mstislav Iziaslavich drove his uncle, Vladimir Mstislavich, out of Vladimir in Volhynia and into exile in Hungary. This aggression, seizing the most important town in Western Rus, could not be allowed to go unchallenged. In the winter, Yuri, Yaroslav Osmomysl, and Berendei auxiliaries marched on Vladimir. The chronicle notes that Yuri was not trying to take the city for himself. As we have already noted, and as was common among the rulers of Rus, he had promised to take care of his brother Andrei's son, another Vladimir, and that was his plan, to put Vladimir in Vladimir. Unfortunately, the people of Vladimir and Volhynia refused outright to accept Vladimir Andreevich, and Mstislav Iziaslavich held the city. So instead, Yuri gave his nephew Dorogobush, Peresopnitsa, and some smaller towns on the Hurin River. further extending the buffer around Kyiv that he had already created by placing his own sons. The situation in Vladimir was a bit complicated by the usual succession complexities. The Mstislavichi were treating Vladimir and Volhynia as their patrimony. Vladimir Mstislavich, as the only surviving son of Mstislav, had the senior claim. Vladimir Andreevich was the nephew of Mstislav, which put him in the same genealogical tier as Vladimir Mstislavich. Mstislav Iziaslavich was a generation younger than either, and that meant he had the junior claim. But once again, force and popular acclaim outweighed birthright. The next incident involved a fellow by the name of Ivan Rostislavich Berladnik. Berladnik had ruled in the minor town of Zvenigorod and had attempted to take over Galicia at the request of some boyars. He lost the resulting contest and fled to Barlad in Moldova, where he acquired his nickname. After that, he spent his time moving around some of the domains less friendly to Halych, serving Vsevolod and Sviatoslav Olgovich, Rostislav Mstislavich in Smolensk, and ending up with Yuri in Suzdal. This all made him the enemy of Yaroslav Osmomysl, and as Osmomysl was now a close ally of Yuri, Yuri agreed to hand Ivan over. He was bound and shipped off to Kyiv, but the church intervened on his behalf. Yuri thought better of handing him over and ordered him sent back to Suzdal. On the way, Iziaslav Davidovich's people captured him and took him to Chernihiv. Iziaslav was surprisingly loyal for the time and did not release Berladnik to any of the many emissaries who arrived demanding he be handed over. When it became too dangerous for him to remain in Chernihiv, he fled to the Polovtsi in the steppe, where he raided Galician shipping. He briefly returned to Kyiv to claim a domain from Iziaslav Davidovich, but ended his days in exile in Greece. According to tradition, he was poisoned by his enemies. Iziaslav Davidovich's defiance of Yuri in this matter did not come out of nowhere. He had in fact begun approaching potential supporters to organize his own attempt to seize Kyiv. He managed to win over Rostislav Mstislavich and Mstislav Iziaslavich, who were angry over Yuri's intervention in Volhynia. Rostislav sent troops under the command of his son Roman to Chernihiv, and Mstislav marched out at the head of his own army. But on the very day that their combined forces assembled to set forth for the capital, a messenger arrived from Kyiv. The people of Kyiv asked Iziaslav Davidovich to take the throne. Yuri Dolgoruky was dead. The traditional story is that the people of Kyiv did it. If you remember from the last episode, in 1149 they had come out in support of the Mstislavichi and had only accepted Yuri because he was the strongest militarily. So, although the chronicles do not state anything explicitly, we can guess that there was maybe an opposition faction in the city. While they had been quiet for the first couple of years after Yuri returned to Kyiv and appeared to be in a very strong position, the attack on Vladimir and Volhynia, the Berladnik affair, and Iziaslav Davidovich's plotting could have triggered a new round of opposition in Kyiv. The chronicler states that Yuri died on 15th of May 1157 after a drinking session at the house of a certain Petrulo, following which he lay ill for several days. The assumption is that it was the result of poisoning. When the news of his death broke, bands of Kyivans rioted across the city, pillaging the courts and slaughtering officials from Suzdalia. They refused to bury Yuri next to his father in St. Sophia. the expected resting place for a Monomakh and ruler of Kyiv. Instead, he was buried at the Church of the Saviour outside the city. Not so much a sign of disrespect, as this church was founded by Monomakh and the burial was performed correctly, but a clear sign that Yuri was not popular in the city. We've accepted that Rus was distinguished from Western European states by the absence of centralization, and that there's nothing wrong with that. Different peoples can develop in different ways. We've also seen how, despite this, some historians argue that Vladimir Monomakh did try to centralize and form Rus into a unified state, and we've seen how his work fell apart almost immediately as soon as he was dead, due to the peculiarities of lateral succession and the difficulties of keeping everyone happy as the number of pretenders grows with each generation. But that is Rus as a whole. If we look at Yuri's career in Sundalia, he had very successfully taken a peripheral region with a handful of towns that, while old, Rostov and Suzdal had been around since the earliest days of Rus, had never previously had their own princely ruler, and he had made it into an independent and powerful domain capable of dominating Rus. Kyiv remained, for now, the richest and most prestigious city of Rus. In the middle of the 12th century, the Kievan lands had more than 80 towns, while Sundalia had less than 20. But Sundalia was on the rise, and southern Rus seemed stuck in the never-ending chaos of intradynastic rivalry. The question is, can Sundalia continue this development, or will Yuri's many sons pull it apart as they all try to grab their own piece of the pie? Meanwhile, Izyaslav Davidovich is heading for Kyiv. Join me next episode to see how long he can keep it. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.